I bet you probably already know how to play these three chords. But let me tell you, you really get to know the chords you're playing on a much deeper level when you learn how they fit together and how to use the notes around them. Hey, John here, and this is your Tuesday Blues, where every week we help you play better blues with straightforward, to-the-point lessons, just like the one that we're about to get into. This week we're going to talk about a cool way to get to know the tones around three of the most common guitar chords, G, C, and D. And you could really use any three-chord set as long as they're in the same key. More on that later. But this will help you start playing little licks, runs, and fills that are going to sound right because they're in the right key. Step one, pick a scale that fits the chords. And if you're not familiar with how chords fit together in a key, then pick up my diatonic chord builder worksheet. We're going to stick with the major scale here, and we already know that we're playing G, C, and D. And if you've checked out Tuesday Blues number 302, you'll know that these chords are in the key of G major. So we're going to play a G major scale here. The next thing we'll do is strum a chord. We'll take G as our first chord, and we want to make sure that we hold this form as much as possible. So only move the fingers that you need to move, and we're going to play the scale. Now, to keep things interesting, we're going to play the scale from high to low. So that starts on the 3rd fret of the 1st string, the G note. I definitely moved some fingers away from the chord, but I held my ground as much as possible, and when I was forced to move away from the main chord shape, the main chord form here, I was still thinking about this as my home base. I really want you to view your chord shape as the anchor for this lesson. This is where you need to return to. So make sure you know your scale well enough to pick it out and your chord form well enough to come back to it and use it as that anchor, that grounding point. It's going to come in really handy when we start moving through to the next step. This really helps to attach the quality of the chord, its overall character, and that sound to the scale that it comes from. Next step, play the same tones, the same scale tones, but play them in a different order. Instead of just running down the scale like we did in the last step, let's change things up and make different note choices. In other words, play things a little bit out of order. You can have a little bit of fun and maybe even create a little bit of melody here, and you might hear some licks about to happen. I really want you to pay less attention to timing right now and just play with free time. I really want you to get your ear tuned up to the scale and the chord and how they relate. Each of the notes that I just played are in the G major scale, unless I screwed up, in which case video editing John will be here to correct me. But assuming that's not the case, those notes stand. They are within the G major scale. And it works perfectly over a G major chord because the notes that make up this G major chord, well, they come from that scale as well. There are only 3 notes. We've got G, B, and D, just some sort of repeating going on when we play a full 6-string chord form. But those are 3 of the 7 notes, and this gets you used to hearing different tones like that E note, right? Not in the G major chord, but it is in the G major scale. You hear that, you might like it. Same with the F sharp. I really like that sound. That F sharp against G. So practicing the scale in this way essentially helps to open up your ear so that you can hear how these different tones from the scale really color the chord. Now, to take this to the next level, change to our next chord. In this case, it's C, but we're going to stick with the same sort of approach by playing our scale tones from G. And this really gets interesting because this chord, C, is certainly from the scale as well. By definition, to be diatonic, they have to come from the same scale. So these tones really sound cool. They're going to work with everything that we play from the G major scale. Same rules, try to hold down the chord as much as possible as you play through some variation of the scale notes. Stick to the scale, play them in a little bit of a different order. Well, I think this is where things get really interesting because we've still got the same scale, the scale that ties the G, C, and D chord together, but we're playing it with a different chord. So G major over this C major chord, and it really brings out some cool nuances, the relationship between the C major chord and the G major scale. All right, I hope that's making sense. We're keeping the scale the same and changing the chord and still kind of playing around with the scale notes and creating some sort of melody, or really just trying to avoid playing it note for note with the scale at this point. Getting out of position only when you have to. And I needed to get that F sharp, which sounds really cool here again over this C. Sounds good here as well. It's got kind of a poncho and lefty vibe happening there. But our next step is to take that same concept and move on to our D chord. These are the three really main chords that we're focusing on here, G, C, and D. So now all that's left is to take our D chord, play it, and work in the tones of the G major scale. So same as before, the notes that you heard are within the G major scale, but notice how some of them really stood out because we're playing them in the context of our D chord. Think about that C. That really gives that dominant 7 vibe. You can kind of hear some D7 happening when you play that, but we're still pulling from the notes from the G major scale. Now, the next step is to take these three chords, chain them together, and play through them while integrating our little scale exercise. You might come up with something like this. Hopefully by now you realize a few things. There are so many great notes to create melodies or using licks and solos right near your chords. You don't have to look far. If you can play the chord, you're just a few steps away from generating some really cool lead ideas. You can hear how the chords color the sound of the scale and vice versa, and certain tones just kind of grab your ear. Write that down, note it, make note of that, and use it to your advantage when you create. This will also really help you get comfortable with the scale. Focus on one chord set like G, C, and D, and use one scale to solo. Create some lead lines, little quick runs to really reinforce this strong tie between the chords and the scale. Remember to grab your copy of the Diatonic Chord Builder worksheet. You can grab that right up here. It will really help you build a great understanding of how chords work together within a key. And if you want to keep learning, click or tap right over here and check out the next video that I have for you, and I'll see you over there. Until then, practice smart and play on.